Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Dune Spice Wars, where today I'm going to be playing as the smugglers and trying my absolute best to take advantage of what they do best, their unique smugglers hideout. I'm going to try and utilize it to get some extra influence and money and really prioritize scouting. But that's not what this video is necessarily about. Before I begin, though, a quick shout out to us for nearly reaching a huge milestone. I'll be celebrating it live on stream. We might even cross over it live on stream on the 1st of May. So if you're watching this video as soon as it goes live, I will see you at 8 p.m. GMT if you're around. In this video, though, I want to talk about Dune Spice Wars balanced or broken. It's something that I've grappled with a little bit as I'm making my Dune Spice Wars tier list video to try and figure out how to rank the different houses in this game. Smugglers versus the Fremen, Atreides versus Vlad. It's so difficult to try and compare them because their playstyles are so unique. It's actually another element that I'll be discussing in this video while I try and dominate the world in smuggler fashion. Let's begin. First up, I think that there is potentially a few balance problems. I'd like to address those first before moving through to the strengths and then sort of rounding it out. So there are a few things that I've come across. Granted, it's an early access release and a brilliant one at that. But first and foremost, I think that the way that the player interacts with the AI, particularly around trade, needs some work. Trade interactions are very easy to gamify, probably a little bit too easy. The trade slider makes it incredibly easy to predict the outcome. And by and large, the AI doesn't tend to throw many spanners in the works, maybe only around treaties in my experience. And even that's been fairly few and far between. I think that the trade is also not only easy to gamify, easy to sort of play the AI to just sort of give you what you want, but it also appears to lack any sort of tactical prowess as well. So it's not just the fact that you can rely on, let's say, 700 plastic always equaling 500 Solari, right? Let's say in your mind you can kind of figure that you can always do that trade-off regardless of who you're trading with, regardless of the situation. That's one thing. The other thing, though, where this becomes an issue is if you're fighting against a player, if you're actively destroying their capital, they will still trade you gold to fund your war if you're in a deficit. So there's sort of two levels to this. There's the basic gamification, where maybe intel at the start is too easy and overpowered, and the AI will always give you the plastic and Solari you need to build up much faster than they do in exchange for intel that they can't use against you. So there's maybe a distributional element. And then secondly, there's a real lack of tactics as well. One other slight tangent, but still perhaps to do with the AI, acknowledging, of course, that AI is an incredibly difficult thing to code in these games. Absolutely. But one of the other things is votes. I've noticed the AI votes incredibly poorly. Not always. There are some times where they can seem to pull it off. But by and large, again, quite easy to gamify the votes here. When you place that on top of the fact that they're not trading very tactfully as either, this becomes a real multi-layered issue because you're gaming them out of their influence to outvote them in a scenario where they may not have really been voting in their best interests anyway. So I think in terms of the AI, in my experience, and I would love to hear yours, your comments and feedback have just been brilliant over the last week or so. By the way, shout out to everybody who's left a comment, whether it's been a nice word of feedback or some really good things about the gameplay that I might have missed, or even things that you've experienced that I haven't. I've really enjoyed reading them all. So just thank you so much. But moving swiftly along, I do think that there's a overall overarching issue here with the AI, with voting and with trading, maybe a few other areas as well, and it does need to be addressed. Now, acknowledging, of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is early access, but also that AI is difficult to code, and there are many complex layers with Dune Spice Wars' balance as well. We'll get to that in a little bit. Next thing, and something that maybe we need to just keep in the back of our minds a little bit as well, as we're having this discussion, as we're playing through and thinking about the different strategies or tips and tricks, is how this plays out in a multiplayer setting. Because while I've just critiqued the AI in terms of its trade and in terms of its votes, in a multiplayer setting, this would work very differently. So, one of the other things that's likely constantly playing in the mind of, I assume, Shadow Games as they're going through this, but also as us as players, is we know that multiplayer is coming to Dune Spice Wars. We know that the game will have some sort of at least one game mode, maybe multiple, maybe some competitive settings where we will be fighting against real players if we so desire. And it's something that I'll be interested in at least trying out. So, how do you then balance these interactions while also balancing them in a multiplayer setting? That's an incredibly difficult question to answer. My gut feeling at the moment is that it could either just apply to everything, and that some of these AI intricacies will never quite be fixed, and that's okay. Or the other option is perhaps a competitive rule set for multiplayer. I'm not sure. We'll have to see how that plays out throughout early access. It's something that will be on my radar regardless, though. Let's move through now to perhaps one of the meatier points around some of the issues or balance problems with Dune Spice Wars, and that's the actual factions themselves. Every faction in Dune Spice Wars is unique, and the more that I play the game, the more I realize just how many layers to this real-time strategy, Forex strategy, ultimate blend that is Dune Spice Wars has. I am currently working on a tier list video. I've produced a faction guide already, which sort of roughly takes you through what each faction does well, some of the playstyles you might want to employ to try and figure out which one's best for you. And also maybe some picks around which counselors are better than others. But I'm still working on a concrete tier list. And the reason is that balance is a very interesting thing in this game. I thought that Humankind was going to be a difficult one balance-wise before it came out, because of all of its different culture combinations. For those unfamiliar, Humankind, a 4X historical strategy game, and every era in the game, across the game's 5 or 6 eras, you change culture. You get a new civ, a new building, a new unit. It leads to over 2 million combinations and more. How do you balance that? Dune Spice Wars is in a very different situation. There are currently only 4 houses. You'd think it would be fairly easy to place them down, yet it's not. Harkonnen, for example, seems to be the most powerful, or at least emerging as what I theorize might be, simply put, the most powerful. Perhaps it's the most powerful faction in terms of ease of use and likelihood of victory. It strikes a great balance between not being too complex, not having too many layers, but also just being generally strong. Combat drugs, oppressing regions. Their abilities are good, very good. Then we have the Fremen, fast movers, nice bonuses, all-round good units. I think the Fremen are emerging equally, actually, as a simple, effective, powerful faction in this game, and their sandworms set them apart from the rest. Atreides, the diplomatic might that is, incredible power, peaceful annexation of villages as well. That might be a little slow around the edges. And then this, my spyware inside of my underworld headquarters, as I establish them here against the Atreides. These things established fast, they're cheap, and man alive, the bootleg market makes a lot of money. And also, I'm starting to feel like the statecraft improvements are just as useful as well here. My point is that each of these factions is incredibly unique. Not just their unique abilities or improvements that I've just discussed, but everything else as well, right? Unique military units, some a unique way of harvesting spice. Every single one has unique technological developments, different interactions with the council or who they're paying their taxes to. Every single element of this game is specialized and refined via each and every faction. And so when I see discussions or when we have them live on stream around balance and whether one is more broken than the other, and there are, in fact, it's not a will, it's an R. There are absolutely overpowered combinations. Absolutely. The broader question is, whether those combinations need to be fixed and addressed as much as me, for example, as much as I as much as I need to be fixed. That is true. What I meant to say was, as much as I believe maybe there needs to be some fixes around how the AI is considering and making trades. Personally, I consider those fixes as Dune Spice Wars moves through its early access to actually be more important than necessarily addressing individual tweaks and balances with houses. However, that being said, I do fully expect us to run into maybe 3 or 4 insanely broken combinations. Add that earlier layer of multiplayer that we were thinking about earlier, and then you open yourself up to a whole lot more. That's a little bit outside the scope of this video. And I also think perhaps a little bit outside the scope of balance considerations as well. The human mind will go to strange places. Difficult to balance a multiplayer in any deep, strategic, political city defense strategy game like this. I don't think it would ever happen. I'm going to put it to one side for now, anyway. There are perhaps a few other quick fire improvements. Pillaging could be too powerful at this point. It might just be. Intel earn could be too high. Knowledge rates could stall a little bit in the later game. Maybe that could be tweaked to fix some pacing. Although, to be fair, I think pacing's pretty bang on. Speaking of pretty bang on, let's now change pace a little bit. I don't want you to move away from this video, to click away from this video with the wrong impression. Dune Spice Wars is actually a very well-polished early access experience. Not only are the game's mechanics relatively well-polished, incredibly well-refined, the game itself, in terms of how it performs, pretty well. How it sounds, great. How it looks, good. Moreover, I've personally found it a very enjoyable experience, and crucially, as you might have already picked up, a very unique one. It doesn't quite sit within any perfectly defined or boxed strategy game genre. And as you muck around with every little element, like one of my favorite units, this sniper right here, by the way. But as you muck around with all these little elements in Dune Spice Wars, you start to realize just how unique and intricate this game is. Of course, building on the inspiration from Shadow Games' Northgard and similar broader strategy game experiences. Overall, I think that the game is filled with an emerging number of ludicrous combinations as far as balance is concerned. Consider what happens when more houses are added, potentially more counselors. As the game expands, maybe more mechanics or units. The sky's the limit here. Definitely in terms of source material as well. My goodness. I have heard from so many people who have told me about different houses or factions or vehicles or units or supplies that they want to see or could see or are excited to see in future. And I think that will not only further complicate balance issues, but perhaps also further negate them. The more layers you add, the more strategies you employ, the more difficult it becomes to balance what is broken, but also perhaps less necessary it becomes because you have many more options at your disposal. And Dune Spice Wars really does give you a lot of options at your disposal already. From the factions in the game through to its counselors and the many different playstyles. Here in this game, I'm choosing to adopt a pretty heavy sort of diplomatic stance for the smugglers. Something I had initially ignored in my first playthroughs, but after talking with a few people in the comments on my faction guide video and sort of listening in a little bit, I thought, actually, yeah, let's try that. And it seems to be working really well. I think that playstyles will continue to emerge and that will be better for balance, not worse. And so if you're one of the people who are concerned about balance issues in this game, I wouldn't be. I think that by and large, they're okay. Now, if you're sitting down for a LAN party multiplayer session, you might need to defend your capital a lot more than you will in a single player experience, though. And so when we move back and then reflect on the video here as a whole, it's sort of a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, Dune Spice Wars is not necessarily a perfectly balanced experience. In fact, I think Spiffing Brit would have a field day with it. But arguably, It doesn't really need to be. And that's generally the stance that I'm taking, except for a few things around the edges, deeper mechanical issues or issues with the AI, or perhaps emerging issues as more factions, more houses are added to the game, particularly in a multiplayer setting, although we could look to gloss over that a little bit as well. I think finally it's important to acknowledge, of course, as I've mentioned throughout, that this is an early access release and a damn polished early access release at that. From what I've heard, Shootout Games, the developers behind this and behind Northgard, are pretty fast, pretty responsive, and fairly, in fact, no, fairly is probably an understatement, very attuned to community sentiment and to how the sort of meta game is developing. Because ultimately, as balance issues emerge, if there really are critical ones, it will be the game's meta that will reflect that, because people will slowly start to convert over, playing the house that emerges as the strongest one, using the strategies that emerge as the best. That's natural, it's human instinct. I'm looking forward to the future of Dune Spice Wars' early access. We're unsure at the moment how long exactly it will last. Feels like it could be a long form early access. So why not sit back and enjoy, see how it develops. Thank you very much for joining me today in Dune Spice Wars. Balanced or broke? Hopefully I've encouraged you to think a little bit more about this as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts as always. I'm keen for a genuine discussion in the comments. I'll see you next time.